It's a tremendous honor to welcome Amy Wax to this podcast. She is the professor of University of Pennsylvania Law School, and today we're discussing some of the controversies that's surrounding her name as of late. Welcome to the show, Amy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I've listened to your frequent appearances on the Glenn Lowry Show, which is one of my favorite podcasts, and so I do know bits and pieces about the story, which you are the center, and it's a rather unhappy story. So tell me about your current status, social and employment wise, when it comes to your university.
Well, I can't go into too many details because my case is ongoing and hasn't yet been definitively resolved. And my legal advice has been to not publicize the details until there is a final resolution, at which time, by the way, I do intend to go full publicity. I don't intend to honor any kind of confidentiality uh, requirement, and I've not agreed to any. Because, of course, Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, is trying to impose confidentiality just to protect themselves from criticism, not to protect me. So this all will become very public. But that's just an aside. Uh, Basically, what's happening is Penn has brought charges, specifically my law school dean, now ex law school dean, because he's stepped down and there's a new dean, brought charges against me, a whole grab bag of charges, a whole laundry list based on comments that I have made in the media, some on Glenn Lowry's program, some in other podcasts, some in various articles, and then sort of at the end tacked on a few, less than a handful of supposed comments that I made to students, which were harmful or hurtful or otherwise unacceptable. And those comments that I allegedly made to students are either made up, I deny having made them, they're all stale, 10, 15 years old, they're isolated, and and some of them are twisted out of context and they're innocuous. Why have they done this? Because there is a long tradition in academia in the United States of protecting so called extramural speech. That is, when a professor goes on a program like Glenn Lowry's or makes statements in the press or even in print as part of their scholarly work or as part of being a public intellectual, those statements are protected from sanction and from discipline. Even if a lot of people object to them or find them offensive or upsetting, that it's part and parcel of academic freedom, free expression, that those statements can't be punished. And that's especially true if a professor has tenure. I mean, technically, tenure shouldn't be necessary because those principles apply to anybody working in academia. But I have tenure, and tenure is supposed to be a kind of added layer of protection. Of course, none of this made any difference to my dean. A number of students, especially minority students, complained to him, and that's because I've said critical things about the black community, about on racial topics, and they don't want those things said. They don't want those things expressed or thought in the academy. And so my dean, instead of saying to them, well, that's the way the game is played, we have free expression in the academy, and the fact that you object doesn't mean anything, I'm not going to take action. Instead of saying that, which he should have, he said, oh, I'm going to file charges. So now we're 2+ years into these charges. There's a very complicated process at Penn for dealing with these charges. It's, not a process that is characterized by due process or fair rules at all. Even though they promise you fair rules, you don't get them. Take my word for it. So I've been put through a star chamber and a process that would make the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, look fair. But once again, there's no final decision yet. I expect there to be uh, pretty soon. And what's the goal here? The goal is to get rid of me. The goal is to fire me. I'm a conservative, a self-described, self-avowed conservative in a institution that is far left, has been captured by the far left, and the universities, the far left of the universities, want to get rid of their conservatives. They don't want students hearing the full spectrum of opinions and views that are out there in the real world. They want them hearing a very lopsided, one sided version of reality.
So, do you find that all of these legal slash bureaucratic processes impede on your work as a teacher?
Well, they haven't impeded so far because they cannot take away my courses entirely until there's a final decision. Now, there is one way in which they have impeded, which is that the dean took me out of the first year classroom. I was teaching a mandatory course in civil procedure for years and years. The dean decided that he would strip me of that responsibility, which, arguably is his prerogative to do, although that's something that I plan to contest. So it means that I'm reaching far fewer students than I ordinarily would, and I think that's a shame. But then the course that I teach, the mandatory course, is really pretty much a cut and dried, straightforward course that, doesn't have any political valence or the like. But, some of the minority students said, oh, it's traumatizing for us to have to learn from this person. We can't learn from this person. It's psychologically harmful. This is the standard issue rhetoric from the wokeistas, right? To get rid of the people who disagree with them. So it has impacted me in that way. But I still teach a seminar in conservative political and legal thought. I invite a speaker, Jared Taylor, who they object to my inviting, who is a white nationalist. I'm not sure how he would precisely describe himself, but he represents a certain point of view on the right in the United States that the students really need to learn about and hear about because they're completely ignorant of it. All they know is that they're supposed to hate these people and persecute them. That's all they know. They know nothing about their actual beliefs. So I've taught my standard course the way I want to, and I've taught remedies, and also I've taught a seminar in neuroscience, law, and responsibility. So I'm doing all of that. I think it has reduced the number of students who sign up for my classes because I think there is peer pressure and bullying in the law school of students. Actually, it's kind of a student to student phenomenon where students censure and censor each other. So that has intimidated some students out of taking my class. But I still have 8 students in my seminar. It's an excellent course. I have a number of students in my other seminars. So there are still students that are brave enough to sign up for my classes, even though their classmates disapprove.
I see. Well, on the topic of Jared Taylor, I recently had Professor Carol Swain on this program. She
Yes.
wrote an extraordinary book called The New White Nationalism, where she lists Taylor as one of the white nationalists. So I suppose there's the topic of academic freedom, but I think it can be quite unseemly if if you if you invite somebody of that, I guess, specific set of beliefs. So, what was the context in which Mr. Taylor was invited into the seminar, and why do you believe that his views could
Well,
be
I
helpful?
I think I already addressed that. I don't, words like unseemly, they're very vague. I'm not really sure why it's unseemly. The topic of my seminar is conservative political and legal thought. Part of the conservative movement, albeit, fairly out there on the right in the United States today, is a faction of people who I guess you could describe it as white nationalist. I don't really think these labels are very helpful. but people who have views about what the United States should be like, about the values and practices that should be preserved, about the importance, let's say, of European Americans dominating the culture and dominating the demography in the United States, that that is the best thing for our country, and they give arguments for that. Um, the people that I invite, Jared Taylor is the only one I have invited. They're not violent. They don't advocate for violence. They certainly don't advocate for any kind of persecution or genocide. I mean, in that respect, Hamas is 100 times worse than these people are. So, I think if you were to compare the two, people like Jared Taylor are benign. They just have a certain vision for what the culture of the country should be based on its historical origins, provenance, values, and circumstances. And I think it's important to hear them out and hear why they have the opinions that they have. Because there are people out there who agree with them. So their arguments are absolutely worth hearing and taking on. I don't think the word unseemly really helps us at all, because you have to explain why it's unseemly to invite someone like Jared Taylor, let's say, but not unseemly to invite someone on the far left, let's say, a proponent of Black Lives Matter. I think it's very hard to do that, frankly. This is supposed to be an educational experience. I guess I got a little off the path here, but let me bring it back. The point of a school is to educate, and we need to educate our students about what people are thinking. They don't know, right? They have a one sided, narrow, partial educational experience behind them. It's overwhelmingly lefty ideas, left leaning values. There's just radio silence for anything on the right. Take my word for it. They know nothing. They know less now than they did 10 years ago, less 10 years ago than they did 20 years ago. Our educational system has just completely gone off the skids.
So I suppose your views on Jared Taylor is very much similar to my views of, I guess, yourself in that um, his, I think that your views, although they need to be expressed and they need to be heard, also needs to be challenged. And I think in the academic environment, any and all views, if you're a adherent to, a truly liberal education, and any and all views, no matter how moderate or extreme, should be subject to a challenge. So that's the question that I'd like to direct to you. So would it be preferable or true to the academic model to have, say, someone of the opposing side uh, present arguments against the views and remarks which you have expressed?
People do that every single minute of the day. That's called college. That's called the university. The university is chock full of people who adhere to left leaning views. They are, from morning till night, expressing those views, often under the guise of neutrality, which is false. My opinions, to the extent that they're to the right of what most people believe in the university, are relentlessly subject to critiques, relentlessly subject to criticisms. It never stops. So it's absolutely happening. What isn't happening is that the left leaning views of 98% of the professors, they are not being subject to criticism, to scrutiny, to critiques, to counter arguments. And I know that to be true. My students tell me. They tell me what happens in the classroom when they're discussing hot button issues like reproductive freedom or abortion or gay rights or immigration or multiculturalism, and all of the sort of pet woke causes, one and only one opinion, or how to interpret the Constitution or the Supreme Court, how the legal system should function, social justice. What is social justice? How should it be brought about? How big should the government be? What should the government do? They're not getting a balanced view. But what's absent is not the critique of conservative ideas. That's pervasive and relentless. What's happening is the critique of left-leaning ideas is practically absent.
Yes.
And in fact, the students who take my conservative thought class, what I hear from them every year is, wow, this is the first time in 17 years, 18 years that we've been in the education system and in the elite education system, that we've heard these ideas. This is the first time we've ever heard of theorists like Hayek, Burke, Oakeshott, Richard Weaver, James Burnham, Doug Murray, Charles Murray. I could go on and on and on with the names that they either have never heard of or could not tell you the first thing about what they've written or said.
Yes. I think I myself have been steep into many of the names that you've mentioned, and I find many of their ideas very thoughtful and very necessary for American political discourse. Now, what you've pointed out to me is that there's a certain lopsidedness to how politics is being organized in American universities, yourself not included, excluded, sorry, yourself included. That is that there's an overwhelming left-wing circle or left-wing student body and also faculty body, thus many ideas that can strike you and I as being extremely left gets a pass, wherein the ideas that even are just moderately right or moderately conservative gets heavily scrutinized. So, what do you suppose can be a remedy for this?
Well, it's very tough. Okay. I recently gave a talk at a FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression conference, in which I talked about curricular and educational reform. I actually think K through 12, which is a big problem, the lower grades, that there's a tremendous amount of power in the local governments which run that system to reform and restrict what gets taught and how it gets taught. It's pretty much complete and ought to be utilized. But when it comes to higher ed, it's very difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, we're talking about adults here, not children. Adults have First Amendment rights, certainly if they're in a public university setting, so that limits what sorts of restrictions can be placed or efforts to introduce balance, right, can be placed on those institutions. Private institutions aren't governed by the First Amendment at all. And both kinds of higher ed institutions are subject to these very strong institutional traditions of self-governance. So once the left professoriate gets hold of these schools, they perpetuate themselves, right? They decide who gets hired, what sorts of things they can and cannot say that will receive promotion or otherwise be rewarded. And it's very, very hard to break into that system. I think there are ways to do it. What I've proposed is using the federal spending power under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act much more aggressively. That's one measure. The Civil Rights Act, Title VI, says that programs receiving federal money, even if they're private, like Harvard, have to abide by certain rules. They can't discriminate based on race, sex, etc. But I think we could add to that, an aggressive Republican administration could add to that, that they have to abide by the First Amendment, that the people within the institution have the power to sue if they don't, that they have to get rid of their diversity and equity administrations, that they can't require people to pledge fealty to diversity and equity, that they establish independent centers of conservative thought. I mean, there are a lot of things that the government could do if the will was there. Now, that's a big if. That requires a administration which would have to be Republicans, because the Democrats are 1,000% behind the whole woke agenda, right? They're fine with it. It would have to be a Republican administration and a president who's effective, who believes that this is a priority and who makes it a priority. So, I'm very pro Ron DeSantis, not because I agree with every single thing he's done or even think that it's legitimate. There are parts of the Stop Woke Act I think are legitimate, others not. But because I think that he understands the crisis in higher ed. He understands how important it is because it affects the hearts and minds of coming generations and the elites that will be running our country. And that, is a very serious matter. And that he really wants to do something about the status quo. So, I think there are things that can be done, but they need to be done in a very sophisticated way so as not to trench on some of our important freedoms and commitments. And I'm not underestimating the difficulty of doing that.
Mhm. Yes. So I'm sure you are very much familiar with Christopher Rufos's new book,
Right.
America's
Yes.
Cultural Revolution. And I believe in the front of using state power to curb these ridiculous ideologies in universities, Rufo and DeSantis speak with one voice. Now, of course, it can strike the conservatives like myself who believe in the limitation of state power the wrong way. So, why do you suppose that this use of state power is helpful?
Well, you're really onto something here, right? Because it's a double-edged sword.
Yes.
Conservatives have traditionally been quite suspicious of concentrations of power, centralized concentrations of power. They're wary of it. They're wary of its potential abuses. And so you wouldn't expect conservatives to be in favor of using state power to reform higher ed. And yet, I think once again, the judicious use of it within certain limits, like extending the Civil Rights Act, I think that is justified and justifiable because there has been this extreme capture and there needs to be some sort of corrective. Frankly, I am much more interested in K through 12 reform. Now, public schools, K through 12, is an instance uh, of state power being exerted over the minds and hearts and time of our school children. And there are a lot of people on the right who don't even believe in public schools, right, for that very reason. But given that we're stuck with them, and we're talking about children here, okay, which is really a different ball of wax. I think that there's a lot that the states and the school boards, however they want to allocate that power, could do to bring a lot more balance and good sense to K through 12. So I have gone on the record against any sort of sex education, any kind of, sort of pro gay agenda, pro queer agenda in school, really any mention of sort of gay rights in K through 12, because I don't think that it belongs there. Part of this is that I think that in keeping with conservative ideals and commitments, that these schools should show extreme deference to parental authority. Okay, so it boils down to something really simple. You have every right to teach your own children about, gender fluidity and queerness and, homosexuality and how to put on a condom. You do not have the right to teach other people's children that stuff. Absolutely not. Right? That does not respect the privacy and prerogatives of parental authority to the requisite degree. So the footprint of what schools teach, the very subject matter, let alone how they teach it, needs to be drastically shrunk. And the same is true when it comes to racial issues and history and civics. They need to stick to the basics, provide balance in the vision of the United States, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There needs to be more praise for the achievements of our civilization and Western civilization, because that is a more accurate picture, I think, of our society and its history than the one that's being purveyed. And it also fosters the kind of loyalty that is necessary to run a democratic society where people have to have certain basic things in common in order to use that as a platform for disagreeing about others. Right? So I think our tolerance for the full range of ideas at the K through 12 level has to be and ought to be limited, and it's within the authority of the government to do that. So why do I focus so much on K through 12? Because if you get K through 12 right, then higher ed will, I hope, take care of itself. You will send students into higher ed who've had a much more balanced view of many of these issues and will be equipped with knowledge and understanding to see that they are being propagandized, they are being indoctrinated, and perhaps they would, push back harder, and their parents would push back harder, and that might bring some health to higher ed. I would hope so, anyway.
Mhm. So on the topic of K to 12 education, at least from someone who's non-American, I see that American conservatives are, rightly so, focused on the issue of school choice. So by that sense, they would prioritize private school, religious schools, charter schools. But of course, with that focus, they are leaving out the thousands upon thousands, perhaps millions of children who are attending public school and perhaps in the views of both you and I are miseducated in that public school. So perhaps it is an area where, as conservatives, we may have inadvertently ceded ground to radical leftists.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I don't think that school choice and charter schools are a panacea. And the reason for that is that the people who run those schools are coming out of the same educational institutions, the same ed schools, receiving the same kind of teacher training as the teachers in public school are, and that teacher training is radically defective for what it teaches. It doesn't teach the substance of what the education should be. It teaches all of these weird, misguided methodological concepts, many of which are left inflected. So, the fact that you have a choice of schools that are all captured by the left, and it is amazing the extent to which public and private schools are captured by these lefty ideas in the United States. It's really kind of almost a monopoly that they have. It's hard to find a school that departs from that model, and it requires strong-minded people to establish such schools and then attract parents and students to those schools. And I am always amazed at the paucity of schools across the spectrum of different philosophies of education. It's very, very disappointing and unfortunate. But having said that, I am all for school choice. I am all for charter schools. I am all for as much diversity as possible in the educational system, and trying to break the back of the educational unions, the teachers unions. That's all to the good.
Mhm. Yes, and I'm the same page as you. So one of the things I find in these school board meetings and reports of school board meetings, of course, public and also private schools, I suppose, is how anti-parent these school board administrators are. They don't give a hoot what these parents think. They think that they have the key to, forging a successful, well-adjusted adults out the children, like, and they don't really care what the parents think at all. It's
Right.
rather disturbing.
Right. I think that is just a trend that I have been seeing that is deeply, deeply disturbing. I think there are many threads that contribute to that. All of them are pernicious. It's almost a kind of anti-natalism, that parents are a nefarious force. They're not to be trusted. They're backward. They're, reactionary. Their ideas are benighted. They don't have the benefit of, our wonderful lefty education. They don't understand child development. We have to rescue kids from their parents' attitudes and their neglect. There's another side to it, which is the recognition, and unfortunately, it's partly true, that a lot of parents are neglectful and indifferent. We now have a lot of single parent families that are very disorganized and dysfunctional. So there is a lot of dysfunction within the families that didn't exist before, and they kind of seize on that as an excuse for taking over essentially the shaping and the education of children as if they're going to get a better product. The other is there's this kind of ideology, which is a kind of sexual liberation ideology, right? That parents who don't want their children sexualized and exposed to any kind of adult concepts or materials or experiences in the sexual realm, that those parents are have to be countered because that is a repressive set of attitudes. That is a harmful set of attitudes. And there's no proof of that whatsoever, of course. I mean, that's just a dogma, that's an ideology. We have a kind of creeping sexualization of childhood. You can see that in the gender fluidity trans movement, right? You hear a lot of stuff about how very small children are conscious of their gender, their sexuality. We need to let them express that. It's all mixed up with this expressive individualism, this liberation ethos that we can't repress and we can't suppress. We have to allow them to express. This is a very potent brew of dogma, all of which is just, completely made up, completely partial. But what it results in is pushing out and displacing parental authority. One more point about that. The other thing they don't like about parental authority, of course, is that, there's a lot of inequality in families, among families. I mean, there are some families where the parents are very involved, very attentive, they have a lot of resources, they're good parents, mostly upper middle class, they're married, they're very traditional in their structure and in the stability, and those families give their children a huge advantage compared to the families that are much more fragile, single parent families, chaotic, very little or no father involvement, maybe even boyfriends who tend to actually not be good for kids. And that generates inequality. So you want to displace parents and families, the private forces, in the name of equalizing everything. But the problem is you're equalizing everything downward towards this questionable ideology.
Mhm. Now, on the topic of, I guess, sex education in the classroom, that is something that I also find rather perturbed by, because having gone through my teenage years some years ago, I can still remember them. I find that, well, I think it's a fact of every teenager, yourself included, I suppose, that we are all very confused about our sexuality and we need a form of proper adult guidance. And I think whatever the sex education curriculum that is being implemented, they are designed to take away that force of guidance. They they essentially give you the steering wheel, so to speak, and expect you to
Right.
make your way from home to school or something like that. And that I think, well, that I think inevitably results in, well, very much hypersexualized, well, young adults, and also young adults who are very much disillusioned about sex. Like there's the dating pool is not as vibrant as it used to be. Um, and people who are like who receives this like sexualizing in education now feel profoundly confused and alienated and nihilistic about themselves and other people around them. It's a disaster.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. I think you at first you alluded to this perverse inversion. We've kind of put kids in charge. We have a very youth cult like society which says that somehow young people know better than older people. It's very kind of anti-authoritarian attitude, and that's where the trouble starts, right? As you say, give kids the steering wheel. They have no idea where they're going. They're not equipped to steer their way. And don't look to parents and people in authority to tell you because they don't know anything. They're backwards, right? And that's not at all the way it should be. You said I'm sure you were confused too. Well, what's interesting is I wasn't confused. I
Mm,
mean, I was an adolescent, so I had a lot of the uncertainties and problems of adolescence. But I would say on the matter of sexuality, things were very, very clear because the messages I was getting were very, very clear. I was born in 1953,
oh,
and the messages were modesty, care, uh, you know, sexuality. Sex is kind of a very serious and maybe even dangerous thing. You were expected not to have sex in high school. It was almost like a class marker. Only lower class girls had sex. You were expected to be a virgin into college and maybe even beyond, and you had no problem saying no to men because they understood the rules. So I don't, remember it being a vexed thing at all. Without the rules being spelled out explicitly, we all knew what they were. And we also, in terms of our sexual identity, I mean, being a girl was a good thing. Femininity was respected and held up as a positive. It wasn't considered, at least I didn't experience it as oppressive. I mean, there were certain realities that you had to deal with, which was that men, would on some level pressure you for sex. Your job was to push back. And that was the way it was. I mean, we kind of accepted a lot of the differences between men and women as just kind of natural and that we had to work with them. So I think in the 50s and 60s, which everybody loves to dump on, right, there was a lot less confusion, ironically enough. And it wasn't all repressive and horrible. It kind of liberated us to have a fun social life, interact together because the restrictions and the constraints were understood by everyone. And the same with the dating pool. I mean, it's pathetic what's going on now with the hookup culture and everything. With girls, I talk to a lot of young women, and their attitudes towards marriage, towards men, towards motherhood are so incredibly negative, and they're going to end up very unhappy. Uh, there's the future is feline. There are going to be a lot of cat ladies, right? The stuff I hear about, being a mother, which is something that, although I'm a career woman, I'm a blue stocking, I had nothing but a positive attitude towards. Being pregnant is a wonderful thing. When your children are born, it's a wonderful, glorious thing. I mean, all of these positives were taken for granted. And yes, it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge. Now I talk to young women in their 20s and they don't see it in positive terms at all. Many of them are going to end up childless.
Yes. In regards to feminism, it is no surprise that a movement for, by, and I guess of women have little to nothing insightful to say about men.
Well, I think, yeah, what bothers me is the kind of relentlessly negative attitude towards men and masculinity. You know, there's obviously toxic masculinity and then there's constructive masculinity, just as there's toxic femininity, heaven knows, and constructive femininity. And I think one has to have the wisdom to distinguish between the two. What what feminism has peddled to these young women, their ideology, conveniently leaves out all of the contributions that men have made to our society, to our civilization. Men are the authors of civilization. And it isn't just because women have been excluded and repressed. It's just that's the way it is, you know, worldwide and throughout history. The nature of women and men is such that men will tend to make the greatest contribution overall. I know that sounds incredibly sexist and backward, but I do actually believe it to be so. And looking back in the past at all the progress that we've made, especially in the West, and all the wonderful things that have been invented and created and thought of and discovered, you would think that women would be a little bit more grateful, but they're not. It's like a blind spot. Gratitude towards men and appreciation of men, an appreciation of masculinity, and the kind of protector role, the inventor role, the creator role. It just seems totally absent. And that to me is very unfortunate.
Yeah, this I guess demonization and I think at the same time too virtual castration of maleness or manliness as the title of that great book by Harvey Mansfield have shown that by categorizing all of masculinity or maleness as bad, as toxic, what these feminists have done is they have diminished the good, virtuous masculinity and empowered troubling, toxic, so to speak, and destructive masculinity. You know, like consider how many men subscribe to the views of like Andrew Tate.
Well, I don't know much about Andrew Tate, but I would agree with you that toxic masculinity seems to be, you know, forgiven and given a pass. I think part of what's going on, and it's a really important component here, is that women have given up the role of gatekeepers. Women used to be the gatekeepers who, in effect, disciplined men to be their better selves, demanded better behavior from men, and of course the tool they used, the instrument they used was sexual access. Now that's considered, you know, some kind of oppressive trope that you're going to deny access to men who don't aren't poorly behaved. That's contrary to the whole hookup culture. But as a result, you know, we have men essentially being professional cads. I mean, you know, why men would behave better and not just seek as much sex as they could possibly find, if women allow them to do that, is kind of a mystery. I don't know why women allow that. They've convinced themselves that there's one sexuality, that sexuality is male, which is as many encounters as you can manage, and, you know, in this indiscriminate way, uh, variety and hypersexuality. Well, most women aren't that way. I'm sorry, that's not their nature. Um, but we seem to have convinced a lot of women that it is. So I think that, you know, women have been sold a bill of goods by feminism. I think feminism has a lot to answer for. And as a result, there is so much unhappiness out there. There is so much psychological pathology out there among young women. There's so many mental health issues, and you would think that that would, be a wake up call, but doesn't seem to be working.
I think about the year 1998, where it was revealed, obviously, that Bill Clinton had an extramarital affair with Monica Lewinsky. And feminists like Gloria Steinem, I can remember, rallied behind Bill Clinton because they believed that he would preserve Roe versus Wade. So, in an attempt to, I guess, bolster uh, political victories, they made a, I guess, social and cultural blunder.
Well, yeah, that was unfortunate, but they made a concerted decision that they had to back the Democrat. But on for every Bill Clinton where they give him a pass, of course, there's a dozen guys who get stuck in the Me Too machine for similar indiscretions. I'm not saying that such indiscretions will ever entirely go away, but we used to have an ethos, a set of understandings and constraints that tried to minimize them, or at least keep them off, off stage. I think there's a lot to be said for discretion. And we don't even really expect discretion anymore. There's a wonderful saying by Lord Patrick Devlin, who was this 19th century, lived into the 20th century British conservative. I think he was a judge, he was a jurist. And he had a debate with HLA Hart about whether homosexuality should be decriminalized. But one of the things he said in that debate, he thought that it should not be decriminalized, was fornication, well, that's an old fashioned word meaning extramarital sex, will never be stamped out. The key is to keep it within bounds. And I think what we have abandoned in our society is all of the norms and the mechanisms and the devices that we have had to keep bad behavior, bad sexual behavior within bounds. It can never be stamped out. And in fact, conservatives wouldn't want it to be stamped out because that would be too tyrannical, that would be too despotic. That would require a degree of social control that is, for conservatives, extreme. Conservatives believe in social control, but not too much, right?
Yeah.
Has to be just the right amount uh, to keep it within bounds. And I think we have abandoned all the mechanisms for keeping bad behavior in bounds, except these kind of sledgehammer extremes of, Me Too prosecution and persecution. Not stigma, not disapproval, not you better shut up about your extramarital affairs because if your wife finds out, she'll divorce you and your family will go bust. And that, of course, makes it more difficult to have one, right? Um, so we've lost a lot of those constraints.
So moving on to the topic of race relations in America, do you suppose that the comments that you've made, real or imagined, would have been less controversial if you've made it like 10 or 20 years ago?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because, I mean, a lot of these conversations were taking place 20, 25 years ago in a much more open way. There were people talking about, ghetto culture, the culture of poverty, the dysfunction of the black family. And I mean, there were people who were not happy about that. If you think about the Moynihan Report in the mid 60s, Moynihan got a lot of flack for that. And there were people who, um, you know, stigmatized him or rejected him. But there were other people who were willing to talk about it, even black people. And I remember attending conferences and symposia where these concepts could be openly aired, and people on both sides of the aisle were willing to talk about it. This is sort of pre-cancel culture era. I think now it's just so completely taboo to criticize anything about minority habits, behavior, whatever. We have Ibram Kendi who says there's nothing wrong with black people. You can never say there's anything wrong with black people. And if there's any disparity or any problem, then it's always white people's fault. Always, always. So the kind of systemic racism, structural racism ideology is relatively new. The whole woke dispensation. Actually, a great example of how things have changed is in the wake of the Harvard case last spring. The Supreme Court invalidated affirmative action pretty much and said, at least under the Civil Rights Act, institutions have to be colorblind. There has been radio silence at my law school. There has not been any kind of panel discussions or presentations where people get up and analyze those decisions legally, trying to figure out if they make sense, where they come from. The usual presentation and program that you would expect in a law school, right? Let's talk about this case. It's a really important case. Let's go through the decisions and analyze them. None of that. Why? All I can infer is that they don't want to upset and harm and traumatize the minority students. The minority students want to be protected from ever having to hear anything in defense of what the Supreme Court did. Right? Now, you could ask yourself, how can anybody get proper training as a lawyer if they're going to be protected, right, from having to listen to a defense of an opinion or a position that they don't approve of? But that's what they expect. They expect to be protected and shielded from even the statement of a position that they don't agree with.
Now, the way I see it, there are two camps when it comes to, I guess, what's going on with Black America, so to speak. There's of course, the legacy of slavery camp that states that everything is something has to do with American slavery or Jim Crow. So any and all facet of American public life or even private life is tainted with that. And there's the camp of, I guess, people like Glenn Loury and to an extent people like Thomas Sowell too, who believes that there are problems within, say, Black culture or the Black community at large. I guess unwed mothers and
Criminality.
yes, among Black men and such, and they need to be resolved. So it can be a bitter debate if you allow it to be. But so tell me about your view when it comes to these like camps.
Well, I think I've made it pretty clear from many of the things that I've said and argued or written that I'm very much in the Thomas Sowell, Glenn Loury camp. And, I do believe that there are behavioral problems, disparities, elements in the Black community that can only be resolved by the community itself, that they are responsible for a lot of the problems and deficits and gaps and disparities that we see. And as a kind of corollary of that, these are things that people can only do for themselves, that the government really is quite limited at this point because they've tried a lot of things and they haven't really worked, is quite limited in what it can do. So I'm very much sort of a self-help person, which I think Glenn Loury is too. And also Thomas Sowell would probably sign on to that. I don't think these discussions have to be bitter.
Mhm.
I think they only become bitter because there is a dogmatism and a moralized dogmatism that has crept into this, whereby we now have a Manichaean view that if you're a good person and if you're on the right side of history, then you believe in the legacy of slavery story and no other story can be told. If you're an evil person and a bad person and a racist, or what they call a race realist, then you'll reject that story, but you deserve to be condemned. and you're an anti-black person, which I don't think you could say that Glenn Lowry or Thomas Sowell fall into that category, but if you're white, it's very easy to accuse you of that. Um, and I think the whole discussion is just totally stalled. And what that means in practice, and it's very sad, is that with few exceptions, and I have met some exceptions, young black people have been co-opted into, one story. They're sticking to the story. It's very hard for them to deviate from that story and be reflective about it, or come up with any ideas for improving things that don't buy into the racism paradigm and the anti-racism paradigm. And I think that's a formula
Yeah.
for stagnation. I don't think things are going to improve with that attitude. They have not improved actually on three important fronts. And what are those fronts? Number one, the breakdown of the family, which ironically has gotten worse since the Civil Rights Act than before the Civil Rights Act, right? So it's sort of hard to attribute it to racism when we have less racism now, at least objectively, but the family is more fragile. 74% of black children are born out of wedlock. That's a catastrophic number. Secondly, we have high rates of black criminality. You can try and sweep it under the rug or deny it, but I think objectively speaking, it is obvious that, especially for violent crime, blacks commit crimes at much higher rates than other groups, and that wreaks havoc. I mean, if you don't have public order, people are going to shun you. They're going to shun your neighborhoods and your communities. And that's what they're doing. I mean, white flight is worse than it has ever been. And it affects liberals, lefties, progressives, conservatives. They all flee these neighborhoods pretty much in large numbers. And then you have educational disparities. You have gaps in test scores, educational achievement, any kind of measure of cognitive ability or knowledge. They're still there, one standard deviation more or less, and they're not closing. In some ways, they're getting worse. There are fewer black male medical students today than there were in 1976. And a number that, of course, is never publicized. That's the other problem, of course, is that the media routinely hides these numbers, lies about them, commits sins of omission. The media is just completely distortive of what is happening in Black America. So those three problems persist.
So, final question. I know that for the legacy of slavery camp, the Constitution of your lovely country, the United States, is interpreted through the lens of the founders, or specifically how flawed the founders were. People who own slaves write this document that says all men are created equal. But for conservatives like you and I, we look upon these principles. We acknowledge the flaws, but we look at these principles are worth enshrining. So I guess for someone who's a constitutional law professor, how would you defend this marvelous documents against its detractors, its anti-racist detractors, to be specific?
Well, first of all, I'm not a constitutional law professor. I don't teach constitutional law. So, but I mean, I am familiar with the Constitution and many of the issues. I teach conservative thought, and we do read the Federalist Papers, and we engage in some of the debates surrounding the Declaration versus the Constitution. And I guess I would say, conservatives are very, very conscious of, imperfection, that from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. And we will never have utopia on earth. But what we do have here in the United States is a wonderful set of principles and precepts, a wonderful framework, practical framework for a government that works, that allows us to create a working democracy, which we have done, and one that is open to reform and improvement. And we have reformed and improved our democracy to the point of passing the Civil Rights Act, incorporating blacks and other minorities into the polity, giving them a role in helping to govern. So we have engaged in this project of self improvement, which is marvelous and extraordinary because there are very, very few systems on earth that are capable of that. And we have built the wealthiest country in the world, which has been an engine of innovation, of creativity, of human happiness and prosperity like no other, and is still attracts people from around the world who are desperate to live here. So how can that be if we're so awful? There's a disjunct between what is said about us and the critics who live here, of course, enjoy all of the benefits of living here. And I'm not saying we're perfect, and the reality, right, of people voting with their feet, holding us up as a beacon, all of the problems that we have addressed and tried to solve, and of course our great the engine of creativity and innovation and invention and advancement and technology on every front that we have represented, once again, uniquely, like no other. So I guess you have to, focus on the virtues. And of course, let me just say as my last parting shot here, one of the problems with K through 12 and our education system generally is that it's now taboo to praise Western and American civilization and all of its achievements. It's literally forbidden to do that, right? That's insane. I mean, that's just crazy. If I were to just start with one reform in the way that what schools teach and how they teach it, I would change that and highlight all the positives because there are a million of them.
Couldn't have said by myself. Thank you very much, Professor Amy Wax of UPenn, for joining the program.
Thank you for having me.
And
Bye.
the best of luck with your